Derek Holloway's hand closed around her right wrist and pinned it flat against the armrest the second she reached for her phone. Her left arm sat splinted across her chest. Fresh break. Every small movement sent fire up to her shoulder. She didn't pull away. She'd learned hours ago what pulling away cost. He stood close enough to hear every word, so she kept her voice flat. "Three-legged wolf's limping again," she said. "I'm at Ashgrove Memorial. She needs help." Derek's grip didn't loosen. He had no idea whose voice was on the other end. Her brother, president of the Hells Angels, 300 miles away. Marcus Doyle, road name Wolfback, went still for 4 seconds. Then he kicked over the chair he'd just been sitting in. He was on his Harley before the door finished swinging shut behind him. 90 miles an hour. A machine that had buried men for less than this. Derek smiled at a woman he thought he'd broken. He had no idea what was already coming for him. 2 hours later, in this same parking lot, Derek Holloway would learn exactly who Marcus Doyle was. Stay with me. The nurse pulled the curtain back just as Derek loosened his grip on her wrist, and his whole face rearranged itself in under a second, jaw soft, eyes wide and wet at the corners, a man transformed into the picture of worry. "How's she doing?" he asked. Already standing, already reaching to smooth the blanket over Claire's lap before the nurse could answer. "She won't tell me how bad the pain is. She never tells me." The nurse smiled at him the way people smiled at men who said things like that. "We've got her on the schedule for a cast within the hour. You're a good one, staying right here with her. Wouldn't be anywhere else," Derek said. And he put his hand on Claire's shoulder, and his thumb pressed in just hard enough that only she would ever know it wasn't tenderness. Claire kept her eyes on the wall clock. 8 minutes past 9 in the evening. She counted the seconds between the nurse's footsteps fading down the hall and the moment Derek's hand finally lifted off her shoulder, and in that gap, she didn't say anything at all. She had already said everything she needed to say. 4 words into a phone, while he stood close enough to hear, and far enough from understanding. 300 miles north, the clubhouse door was still swinging on its hinges. Marco Reyes had been the one closest to the chair when it went over, and he was on his feet before it hit the concrete, his beer forgotten on the table behind him. Marcus, talk to me." Marcus didn't slow down. He pulled his cut off the back of his chair in one motion and had it half on by the time he reached the door, the patch on the back catching the overhead light for half a second. A 3-legged wolf, stitched in silver thread, head low, still moving. "What happened?" Marco said, falling in step behind him. "Who do I need to call?" "Nobody." Marcus didn't turn around. "This one's mine. You want company?" That was when he stopped. Not because he was thinking about the offer. He stopped because he needed Marco to hear the next 4 words, without anything getting lost in translation. "Nobody rides with me." He heard the room go quiet behind him the way a room goes quiet when 12 men who have ridden with a man for 15 years recognize a tone they have only heard a handful of times, and every one of those times, somebody ended up in a hospital, or a courtroom, or the ground. The parking lot outside the clubhouse held a cold that belonged to early November in Ohio. The kind that got into a man's knuckles before he even noticed. His gloves were still hanging off the back of his bike, forgotten. Marcus didn't go back for them. His Harley sat where it always sat, at the far end of the lot, a little apart from the others, not by accident. He swung a leg over it without ceremony, without the small rituals other men performed before a long ride. He was already somewhere else. He was already on a highway that didn't exist yet, doing math in his head that had nothing to do with miles per hour and everything to do with how many hours stood between him and a hospital room he had never seen. 3 words sat behind his teeth, repeating themselves in a register no one else could hear. "She needs help." The engine came alive under him, loud and familiar, and for 1/2 of 1 second, the sound of it almost drowned out the only sentence that mattered. Almost. He pulled out of the lot, and anyone watching might have called it controlled. They would have been wrong. The people who actually knew Marcus Doyle understood that the stiller he looked on the outside, the closer he was to something breaking loose us on the inside, and right now, he was as still as he had been in 11 years. Back in the examination room, Derek had pulled a chair close to Claire's bed and was telling a different nurse, a younger one. Knew enough that she still introduced herself by her first name, about how they'd met, how long they'd been together, how he just couldn't imagine what he would have done if he hadn't been there tonight. "You're lucky to have him," the Czech nurse said to Claire, adjusting the splint along her forearm. Claire looked at the ceiling tile above her head, at a water stain shaped like nothing in particular, and she found something in herself that still knew how to smile in the right places. "I know," she said. She thought about the 8 months before tonight. Coffee, made exactly the way she liked it. A hand reaching for hers in movie theaters without looking first. The version of Derek, who had once driven 4 hours through a snowstorm because she had the flu. She had tried, more than once in the quiet hours when sleep wouldn't come, to hold that man up next to the one whose fingers had just left bruises in the shape of a hand around her wrist. She had never once managed to make them match. Her phone buzzed once against her hip. A single word lighting up the screen where only she could see it. Coming. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Somewhere on a dark highway, a man who had never once in 29 years failed to show up was already closing the distance between who he was and where she sat, and for the first time since Derek's hand had closed around her arm, Claire allowed herself to breathe all the way down to the bottom of her lungs. 90 minutes, she thought. Maybe less the way he rides. She had 90 minutes to decide exactly what she was going to say to her brother and what she was absolutely not going to let him do. Stay close. The part of this story most people never see coming isn't the highway. It's what happens after the engine finally goes quiet. 8 months before any of this, Claire Bennett had been the kind of happy that made other people in the room feel like they were standing too close to a fire. Warm, a little dazzled, careful not to say anything that might put it out. She taught yoga out of a converted garage on Maple Street in Cedar Hollow, a town small enough that everyone in her 6 o'clock class already knew her name before they walked through the door. She had built the studio herself, board by board, 2 years after a marriage ended quietly and without much drama, the kind of ending that left her with a mortgage and a habit of sleeping with one lamp always on. She liked the particular silence of the studio at dawn before anyone arrived, when the only sound was her own breath finding its rhythm against the floorboards. She had met Derek Holloway at a barbecue thrown by Logan Steele, a man Marcus had ridden with for the better part of 20 years, and trusted the way he trusted very few people outside his own blood. Derek had been polite in a way Marcus clocked immediately as rehearsed. A firm handshake, a direct gaze held 1 second too long, the kind of confidence a person performs because somebody once told him it mattered. He'd laughed at the right moments. He was handsome in a way that photographed well and disappeared. The moment you stopped looking directly at him. Marcus had watched him for the better part of an hour that afternoon and said nothing to Claire about what he was thinking, because what he was thinking was uncharitable and unprovable, and because Claire, who had not been consistently happy in longer than either of them liked to admit, was standing next to this man with something warm and real moving across her face. So Marcus had done what he always did when his sister found something good. He'd handed Derek a beer, and he'd stood down. The second time Marcus met Derek Holloway was 3 months later, dropping by Claire's apartment without calling, a habit she had tolerated the way you tolerate a fact about someone you love that isn't going to change. Derek had been sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, and when he looked up and saw Marcus in the doorway, something moved across his face for less than a second. Not fear exactly. Recalibration. The look of a man walking into a room expecting one set of conditions and quickly adjusting for another. Marcus had filed that look away without knowing what to do with it yet. He knew now. What nobody outside that apartment had seen in the 8 months since was the slow education Claire received in exactly how much of herself she was allowed to keep. It started small enough that she'd been able to tell herself stories about it. A comment about a dress that made her change before they left the house. A joke at a dinner party that landed like a slap and was waved off afterward as nothing, just teasing. Why was she always so sensitive lately? A phone left face up on the counter that she eventually learned not to glance at twice. By the 6th month, she had stopped telling Dana, her best friend since college. The kind of friend who operated on the belief that information was always better than silence. The small things. Because the small things had started to add up into a shape she didn't want to look at directly. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. How many people in your own life are carrying a version of this? Small things they've stopped mentioning, not because nothing's wrong, but because saying it out loud would make it real. Claire didn't have an answer for that either. Not yet. Tonight had started over something almost laughably ordinary. A disagreement about weekend plans, a raised voice. Claire reaching for her car keys and saying she was done with the conversation. She had made it as far as the door. That was the part she hadn't told the nurse, hadn't told anyone yet except the one person who needed to hear it most, in 4 words that meant nothing to the man standing close enough to hear them. 300 miles north, somewhere past the second exit for a town called Millbrook. Marcus Doyle leaned into a curve in the highway and let the cold scrape past his face, and he thought about the wolf. He had been 12 years old, and Claire had been 9 when their grandfather brought the animal home. Found half-starved at the edge of his property with one front leg gone. Entirely, the wound long healed over into something smooth and strange. Their grandfather had explained it to them plainly, the way he explained most things. No softening, no metaphor dressed up as comfort. The wolf had a mate once. The mate was the one who'd taken the leg, in a fight over territory that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with what one animal believed it was owed. She doesn't trust easy after that, their grandfather had said. But she trusts. That's the part worth noticing. The wolf had lived another 6 years on that property. 3-legged and unhurried, and Claire had named her Juniper, and the 2 of them had developed a way of checking on her without startling her. A particular low whistle, 2 notes, that Juniper learned to answer by lifting her head from wherever she'd settled in the tall grass. There was a particular evening Marcus still carried whole in his memory. 9 years old, barefoot on the porch steps, watching his grandfather kneel in the dirt at a careful distance from the wolf and say, "Low and even, you don't rush something that's already been hurt by rushing once. You let it come to you on its own time, or you don't get to keep it at all." Somewhere in that same stretch of years, with their father's temper running hot through the house on Linden Street, more nights than either of them wanted to count, the 2 children had built their own version of that whistle, a phrase that meant nothing to an adult ear and everything to the 2 of them. The wolf's limping again meant the storm had already started upstairs. Get to my room, lock the door, don't make a sound. Their father had never once figured it out. He hadn't been listening for it. That was the entire design, the same way Derek Holloway, 3 months ago and again tonight, had never once been listening for it either. The most dangerous men in Claire's life had this much in common. They mistook her silence for an empty room, instead of the place where she'd learned to keep everything that actually mattered. Marcus had not heard that phrase out loud in 11 years. Not since Claire said it to him once in college, over a phone call he still remembered in pieces. A roommate situation that had turned frightening, resolved before he'd even gotten his boots on. He had assumed, the way you assume things about people you love, when the assuming is more comfortable than the alternative, that she would never need it again. The highway opened ahead of him like a question already, half answered. He had 90 minutes, maybe less the way he rode, to arrive at a hospital and figure out which version of himself was going to walk through those doors. The one who solved problems with his hands, or the one who had spent 11 years since the wolf trying to learn there was another way. He didn't know yet. He knew he was going to find out before the night was over. Hold on to that detail about the wolf. It's going to matter again, in a way you won't expect, before this story is finished. Back at Ashgrove Memorial, the cast had gone on white and clean, indifferent to everything that had put it there. Claire sat in the recovery chair with her left arm, immobilized to the elbow, and watched the clock the way you watch something you can't make move faster by wanting it to. Derek had gone to find coffee 20 minutes ago, and had not yet returned, and in the gap his absence left behind, Claire allowed herself 30 seconds, exactly 30, counted in her head the way she counted most things now, to feel the full weight of where she was. Then she straightened her spine and began building the only thing she had left that was entirely hers to control. A plan. She had learned a long time ago. Growing up as Marcus Doyle's younger sister, the only sibling of a man the city of Cedar Hollow had learned not to provoke. That the way you survived a conversation with Marcus was by arriving at it already finished. Not raw, not undecided. A plan he could not argue his way around, because there would be nothing left in it to argue with. She did not want him going after Derek with his hands. She knew exactly what that would cost. Not Derek, who in her plan would lose far more than a night in a hospital waiting room could take from him. But Marcus, who had spent 11 years building something steadier than the 18-year-old version of himself, that used to solve every problem with his fists and his fury, and no understanding of the difference between protecting someone and owning them. She wanted something that would actually end it. Not satisfy something in Marcus's blood for one violent hour, and then leave her cleaning up after a club president's assault charge for the rest of both their lives. She had 90 minutes. She used every one of them, rehearsing sentences, discarding the ones that sounded like she was asking permission, keeping only the ones that sounded like she had already decided. The automatic doors at the far end of the corridor opened at 11 minutes past 11 that night, and Claire felt the change in the room before she saw him. The particular way a space rearranges itself around a man other people have learned to make room for without being asked. A security guard near the front desk straightened up off the wall he'd been leaning against. Two nurses at the station went quiet mid-sentence. Even the overhead television, running a muted late-night broadcast, seemed somehow less loud. Marcus crossed the waiting area in 9 steps. He didn't look at the nurses' station. He didn't look at the rows of plastic chairs. He looked at her cast first. And something moved through his jaw. A tightening, then a release, then a flat kind of stillness that was somehow worse than either. His eyes came up to her face. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said back. And it was such an ordinary exchange for such an extraordinary night that she almost laughed. Almost. He crossed the last 6 feet between them and stopped close enough that she could smell the cold air still clinging to his jacket. And he did something he almost never did in front of other people. He reached out and put one hand, carefully, against the side of her face. 3 seconds. Then he dropped it and stepped back, and the moment closed over itself like water settling. "Where is he?" Marcus said. Not a question. A coordinate he was already plotting. "Marcus, where is he right now?" "He went to get coffee. He'll be back any minute." She kept her voice level, the way she'd practiced for the last 90 minutes. "And before you say anything else, I need you to hear what I actually need from you tonight. Not what your hands want to do. What I need." Something flickered behind his eyes, fast enough that a stranger might have missed it. Grief, not for her arm. For something older. For every version of this conversation they'd had as children. In a house where the asking had never once been enough to stop what was coming. "I'm listening," he said, and the fact that he said it at all, instead of simply walking past her toward the cafeteria where Derek Holloway stood in line for 2 coffees. He had no idea he would never finish drinking together, told Claire more about the last 11 years than anything he could have said out loud. She told him the plan, all of it, start to finish. No omissions, because she had been raised in the same house as Marcus Doyle, and she knew exactly how he detected the shape of a thing left unsaid. He listened with his jaw set and his hands very still at his sides. And when she finished, he was quiet, long enough that she counted 4 seconds before he spoke. "That's not enough," he said. "It's not about enough. It's about it actually working. You burn his life down with your hands, Marcus, and in 6 months it's a story people tell about the Hells Angels roughing up some guy. In a year, Derek's the victim in it. I need something that doesn't let him write that story. I need something that follows him." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look she remembered from exactly twice before in their lives, both times preceding something Derek Holloway was not going to enjoy. "You already know how to do this," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I've had 90 minutes in a hospital chair to figure it out." "Yes. Tell me what you need from me." "Presence," she said. "Not a confrontation, presence. I need him to understand exactly what he put his hands on, without you laying a finger on him. Can you do that?" The silence that followed lasted longer than 4 seconds this time. Down the hall, a vending machine hummed. A gurney wheel squeaked somewhere out of sight. A clock above the nurse's station ticked forward 1 full minute while neither of them moved. Marcus Doyle, president of a Hells Angels chapter that controlled more of the state than most people in Sea Hollow understood, stood very still and did the hardest math of his night. Not how far Derek Holloway's apartment was, but how far he himself had come since he was 18 and angry, and certain that hurting someone was the same thing as protecting someone. What would you have asked of him in that hallway if it were your brother standing there? Most people say they'd want blood. Almost nobody, when it's actually their own arm in the cast, wants what they thought they'd want. Yes, Marcus said finally. I can do that. Derek came back around the corner with 2 coffees and the particular loose-shouldered confidence of a man who believes he has already won. And he stopped 3 feet short of the waiting area when he saw who was standing beside Claire's chair. For exactly 1 second, something raw passed across his face. Not fear yet, but the first cousin of it, recognition that the conditions of the room had changed while he wasn't watching. He recovered fast. He always did. That was, Claire would think later, the most dangerous thing about him. Not the temper, but the recovery time, speed with which he could reassemble himself into someone reasonable. He held out one of the coffees toward Marcus, like an offering, like a man establishing himself as the calm one in the room, before anyone could suggest otherwise. You must be Marcus, he said. Claire's told me so much about you. Marcus looked at the coffee. He looked at Derek's outstretched hand. He did not take either one. I know exactly who I am, he said, and his voice carried none of the heat Derek had clearly braced for, which made it land harder than shouting would have. The question is whether you understand who you're talking to. Derek's smile thinned by exactly 1 degree. I'm not sure I follow. You will, Marcus said. Soon. Look, Derek said, shifting his weight, his free hand opening in the universal gesture of a reasonable man being unreasonably accused. I don't know what Claire told you, but accidents happen. We were arguing. She pulled away. I didn't mean. Stop talking, Marcus said. 4 words, flat and absolute, since something in the cadence of them made even the security guard near the desk glance over. Derek stopped talking. Marcus turned to Claire, and his voice changed entirely, dropping into something low and certain that belonged only to her. I'm driving you home. Both of you can ride in the same truck, or you can find your own way, Derek. I genuinely don't care which. Derek's eyes moved between them, recalculating in real time. The same flash of recalibration. Marcus had clocked at a kitchen table 3 months ago. Except this time it lasted longer, because this time the conditions had changed in a way he was only beginning to understand. I'll drive myself, Derek said. Good, Marcus said. That gives you time to think about Monday. What happens Monday? Marcus didn't answer. He picked up Claire's discharge papers from the chair beside her, folded them once, and slid them into the inside pocket of his jacket. The same pocket, Claire noticed, where a man like her brother kept things he had decided to use later. Monday, he said again, to no one in particular, and walked Claire toward the doors without looking back to see whether Derek Holloway followed. Outside, the parking lot lights buzzed faintly overhead, throwing long yellow cones across the asphalt. Marcus held the truck door for her with his free hand, his other hand resting just above her elbow without quite touching the cast. Careful in a way that contradicted everything Cedar Hollow believed it knew about him. He did not sleep that night. Neither did Derek, although for entirely different reasons. Claire slept 4 hours on her brother's shoulder in the passenger seat of a truck that smelled like leather and cold engine oil, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, while she slept, Marcus made 1 phone call that lasted 40 seconds and used exactly 9 words. On the other end of that call, a man named Logan Steele sat up in bed, turned on a lamp, and started making a list. The thing about a man like Marcus Doyle is that the scariest version of him was never the one who showed up at full volume. It was the one who went quiet, made a list, and waited for Monday. Sunday night, the evening before the apartment, Dana had shown up at Claire's door without calling. The way Marcus did, the way people who loved you long enough eventually started doing. She'd brought a bottle of wine that was, in Dana's own words, appropriate at any hour. And she'd sat across the kitchen table from Claire, with the particular patience of a best friend, who had decided that silence, tonight, was more useful than questions. You don't have to talk about it, Dana said, pouring 2 glasses one-handed because Claire couldn't. I know. Claire turned her water glass in slow circles on the table. I think I want to, though. I just don't know where to start. Start with the part you haven't told anyone yet. Claire looked up at her, and something in Dana's face, steady, unhurried, entirely without judgment, loosened something that had been wound tight in her chest since Friday afternoon. So she told her. Not the clinical version she'd given the nurse, not the strategic version she'd given Marcus in that hallway. The real one, the 8 months of small erosions that had led to a kitchen and a set of car keys, and a hand that wouldn't let go. Dana listened the whole way through without once reaching for her phone, without once saying, "I told you so." Though Claire knew there had been moments over the last 8 months when Dana could have said exactly that, and would have been right to. When Claire finished, Dana reached across the table and took her good hand. "I'm proud of you," Dana said. "Not for what happened, for what you're about to do tomorrow. I haven't done anything yet. You will." Dana squeezed her hand once. "You already decided. I can see it on you." Claire thought about that, lying awake later that night with her cast propped on a pillow, the house quiet around her in a way it hadn't been quiet in months. Dana was right. She had decided. Somewhere between the hospital chair and this kitchen table, the decision had assembled itself without her fully noticing, the way the most important decisions sometimes did. Not in one dramatic instant, but in the accumulation of 100 small refusals to stay smaller than she actually was. She thought about her brother too, 300 miles of history, compressed into one phone call, and 90 minutes on a highway. She thought about how strange it was that the same family that had given her a father, who taught her to whisper code words in the dark, had also given her a brother who, 11 years later, still answered that code on the first ring. Every single time, without fail. Marcus, that same night, sat in his own kitchen, on the other side of the state. The manila folder Claire would carry to Derek's apartment the next morning resting on the table in front of him. He had read through it twice already. He wasn't reading it again now. He was simply sitting with his hands flat on either side of it, the way a man sits with something he has agreed not to use. His counselor, a quiet, unhurried man named Theo, who Marcus had started seeing 4 months earlier, after a conversation with Logan that had gone further than either of them expected it to, had given him a phrase weeks ago that he kept returning to without entirely meaning to. The version of you that wants to fix this with your hands isn't wrong to want that. He's just not the only version available anymore. Marcus wasn't sure he believed that yet. He wasn't sure he didn't either. But he had told Claire yes in that hospital hallway, and he intended to keep that yes intact through tomorrow morning, even though every instinct he'd carried since he was 18 years old was telling him there was a faster, simpler way to make Derek Holloway understand what he'd done. He thought about the wolf again, the way he had on the highway 2 nights earlier. His grandfather's voice, low and certain, in the dirt beside an animal that had already been hurt once by someone who claimed to love her. You don't rush something that's already been hurt by rushing once. Claire wasn't the wolf in that memory anymore, not really. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, Marcus understood that she hadn't been the wolf in a long while. She was the one who'd learned to whistle. He was the one still learning not to rush in. Monday morning arrived in Cedar Hollow the way Monday mornings always did. Gray, unremarkable. Full of people who had no idea that a reckoning had been quietly assembling itself over the weekend in folders and phone calls, and a discharge paperwork packet that documented, in clinical and undeniable language, exactly what Derek Holloway's hands had done. Claire sat at her kitchen table at 9:57 that morning, her cast resting on a folded towel, a cup of coffee going cold beside a manila folder Marcus had returned to her the night before with 4 words. "You'll want this Monday." She had decided, over the weekend, exactly how Monday was going to go. Not Marcus's version. Hers. There had been a conversation Saturday afternoon, the two of them sitting on her back porch with the November cold settling around them, that Claire would think about for a long time afterward. Logan had asked Marcus in front of her what moving first would look like for a man like Derek Holloway. He won't escalate physically if he thinks there's a witness already in the room, Logan had said, turning his coffee mug slowly between his hands. He's not stupid. He understands optics better than most people give him credit for. A pause. But he might try to get to her before Monday. Not physically. He might call. He might show up at her door and try to write his version of the story before she gets the chance to tell hers. He hadn't called. He hadn't shown up. Claire suspected, sitting at her kitchen table 2 days later, that this told her something true about Derek Holloway. He had spent the weekend not in panic, but in preparation, rehearsing the version of events he intended to offer once the conversation finally happened. That was the thing about a man who reduced people to variables. Even his fear was strategic. Logan Steele drove her to Derek's apartment building at 11 o'clock that morning, because Marcus behind the wheel with this particular destination in mind was, by mutual agreement, a variable nobody needed to test. Marcus followed 3 car lengths back in a separate vehicle, his hands steady on the wheel, his jaw set, breathing the way he had taught himself to breathe in situations where breathing required instruction. He was not going up to that apartment. He had agreed to that the way you agree to hold your breath underwater. Not because the urge to surface disappears, but because you've decided the surfacing can wait. Claire sat in Logan's passenger seat with the folder on her lap and her good hand resting flat on top of it. She had changed clothes before they left. Not dressed up, not dressed down, exactly what she would wear on any ordinary Sunday if she happened to be going somewhere that required her to be taken seriously. She had chosen each piece deliberately, the same care she'd used to build her plan. Because she understood something about the psychology of confrontation that Derek Holloway had apparently never learned. The person who arrives looking like they expected to be there already owns the room. "You're quiet," Logan said, somewhere around the second turn. "I'm focused," Claire said, and that was the truth, though it wasn't the whole truth. Underneath the focus, in a place she wasn't planning to show anyone today, her hands wanted to shake the way they had in the emergency room 2 nights earlier. She kept them flat on the folder instead and let the stillness do the work that feeling steady couldn't. Derek buzzed her in on the first try. That surprised her more than anything else that morning. She had braced herself for an intercom standoff, had rehearsed the words for it and the timing of them, and instead his voice came through almost immediately after she pressed the button for his unit. Careful, conciliatory. A register she had never once heard him use in 8 months. The hallway outside his door smelled like someone else's cooking. Garlic and onions from 2 floors down, ordinary and strange against the weight of what she was about to do. She knocked once. He opened it before her knuckles had finished the second beat. He was sitting on his couch when she sat down across from him, hands clasped between his knees, shoulders pulled inward, making himself smaller, in a way that was so unlike the man she'd known for 8 months it landed as its own small shock. She had expected anger. She had expected denial, dressed up in the language of misunderstanding and overreaction that he was so practiced at deploying. Instead, she got a man trying, for the first time since she'd met him, to look like someone who understood he had no leverage left. "Sit down," she told him, though he was already seated. He stayed seated. She stayed standing deliberately, the way she'd planned it on the drive over. The person standing in a room is the person the room belongs to. "I'm going to say what I came to say," she said. "Then you're going to listen to the offer, and you're going to take it, because it's the only version of today that doesn't end with my brother's name attached to whatever happens to you next. Are we clear?" He was very still. "Yes." She opened the folder and laid the discharge papers and the imaging report on the coffee table between them, turned so he could read every line. The radiologist's notes, the date, the time stamped at 4:47 in the afternoon, the diagnosis written in language too clinical to argue with. "I want you to understand the baseline of this conversation. There is nothing you can tell me in the next 10 minutes that I don't already know happened, so don't waste either of our time." Derek's eyes moved over the documents and then back up to her face, and something in his expression cracked along a seam she'd never seen before. Not remorse exactly, but the first honest fear she had ever watched cross his face. He opened his mouth to say something. The beginning of a sentence that sounded like it might have started with "I never meant." And she watched him close it again, before the words could finish forming, as though some new and unfamiliar instinct had finally told him that excuses were no longer currency in this room. "He grabbed your arm." He started and stopped, and tried again. "I grabbed your arm. I didn't think." "You don't get to tell me what happened," Claire said, and she kept her voice level the way she had learned, over the last 72 hours, exactly where her brother got that particular skill. I was there. I know what happened. What I need from you now is a decision. The offer, when she gave it, was simple and absolute, laid out the way she'd rehearsed it on Saturday night, sentence by sentence, leaving no room for negotiation. He would resign from his position to the regional office by the end of the week, citing personal reasons, and he would do it before the human resources complaint she had already drafted made the decision for him in a way that followed him to every job application for the next decade. He would move out of Cedar Hollow within 30 days. He would have no contact with her, ever, in any form. No calls, no messages, no mutual acquaintances carrying messages on his behalf. And he would understand, without anyone needing to say it directly, that the alternative to all of this involved a club that controlled more of the state than Derek Holloway had ever bothered to learn. And if I don't, he started, an old habit of pushing back rising up out of him out of pure muscle memory, his shoulders straightening half an inch, as though some instinct were trying to drag him back toward the man he'd been 3 days ago. Then you find out what Monday actually means, Claire said. She didn't raise her voice to say it. She didn't need to. Outside, on the street below Derek's window, a motorcycle engine idled at a volume, just low enough to be heard, and just steady enough to be understood. Not a threat spoken aloud, but a fact made audible. Derek's eyes flicked toward the window, and then back to her face. And Claire watched the last of his resistance leave his shoulders all at once, like something deflating. Okay, he said, quiet, final, okay. There's a second thing, Claire said, and this part she had decided on her own, somewhere around 3 in the morning, lying awake in a bed that no longer felt like hers. You're going to write down, in your own words, exactly what happened Friday night. Not for me, for the file. In case you ever decide, somewhere down the road, that the story you'd rather tell is one where I broke my own arm. Derek's jaw worked once, twice, and Claire understood she had landed on the one demand he hadn't seen coming. The one that asked nothing of his money, or his job, and everything of his pride. He wrote it anyway. 4 sentences, his handwriting tight and controlled, the same handwriting she had once thought was elegant. She took the paper. She didn't read it in front of him. She folded it into the manila folder along with everything else and stood up. And for one long moment, the two of them simply looked at each other across a coffee table that held, between them, the entire architecture of the last 8 months. I loved you, she said, and it was the only sentence in the entire conversation that wasn't part of the plan. I want you to understand that before I walk out of here. I loved the version of you that drove 4 hours through a snowstorm to bring me soup. I don't know where he went. I don't think I'm ever going to find out. But I loved him, and that's mine to carry, not yours. She didn't wait for a response. She walked to the door, opened it, and didn't look back to see his face. Though Logan, waiting in the hallway, told her later that Derek had sat very still on that couch for a long time after the door closed, staring at nothing, the particular stillness of a man finally understanding the size of what he'd lost. Marcus was leaning against his truck at the curb when she came down, arms crossed, his eyes already on the building's entrance, the way they'd been on the hospital doors 2 nights before. He didn't ask how it went. He looked at her face and read the answer there the way he'd always been able to. Done, she said. Done, he repeated, and something in his shoulders came down half an inch, the closest thing to relief Marcus Doisel's body ever allowed itself in public. He was gone from Cedar Hollow within 3 weeks. The version of events Derek tried to tell a mutual acquaintance at a bar 2 towns over, that Claire had broken her own arm, that she'd exaggerated everything to turn her biker brother against him, collapsed the moment the acquaintance mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone else, until it reached a small circle of people in Cedar Hollow who had already, discharge papers by methodically, been shown the discharge papers by Logan Steele. Derek did not get the version of the story he'd been counting on. Nobody believed it. That, more than anything Marcus could have done with his hands, was the thing that finally followed him out of town and kept following him. 11 days later, Claire Bennett went back to physical therapy for the first time, and to a therapist she hadn't seen in 2 years, and slowly, deliberately, back to the version of her own life that belonged entirely to her. The physical therapist's name was James, practical and encouraging in the way good physical therapists are, occasionally pushing her past the edge of comfort into the territory where actual healing happens. Her therapist, Dr. Whitfield, received her return with the unruffled calm of someone who had expected it. Not because she'd predicted the specific event, but because she understood that healing isn't a place you arrive at once and stay. "Tell me what's different this time," Dr. Wilty asked in their second session. Claire thought about it for real, the way she'd thought about Logan's question in the car. "I handled it myself," she said. "Not alone, I had Marcus and Logan and Dana, but I made the decisions. I chose the timing. I walked in and I walked out, and nobody did it for me." She paused. "That's new. How does that feel?" "Like something I own," Claire said. "Like something that's mine in a way it wouldn't be if someone else had carried it for me." 6 weeks after the cast went on, it came off in sections under a saw that hummed louder than it hurt. And Claire flexed her fingers one at a time and felt something quieter than triumph and more durable. She called Marcus from the parking lot. He picked up on the second ring. "Cast off," she said. A pause, the particular kind she'd learned to read over 29 years. "How is it?" 3 out of 10, ahead of schedule, good. She could hear him moving around somewhere unfamiliar, the particular sound of a space she didn't know. His new habit, Logan had mentioned weeks earlier, of meeting with a counselor somewhere separate from clubhouse business, a boundary he'd set and maintained without announcing it to anyone. "How's that going?" she asked. "It's going. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got today." Another pause. "You sound like yourself again." She stood in the cold November air, with her bare arm exposed for the first time in 6 weeks. And she thought about a hospital chair and a phrase that had once been a child's whistle in the dark, grown up alongside both of them into something strong enough to call a man 300 miles home. "I am myself again," she said. "I just needed someone to hear me say it once. Not as a performance. Not as something I'm saying so you don't worry. Actually good. The version of good that means I'm still working on things. But the foundation's solid." The silence on his end lasted 4 seconds. She counted, the way she always counted Marcus's silences, because they had always carried what he couldn't say out loud. "Okay," he said. Then quieter. "I know. How do you know?" "Because you sound like yourself." A pause and something in his voice that might have been close to tenderness, the way it sometimes was when he forgot to guard it. "You sound like you again." She thought, standing there, about Juniper, about a wolf who'd learned, after everything, that trusting again wasn't the same thing as forgetting what trust had once cost her. She thought that was probably true of people too. Not gone, not erased, just softened at the edges, the way certain wounds soften over time without ever fully disappearing. And she found she didn't want it to disappear completely. Forgetting wasn't the same thing as healing, and she had made her peace with carrying certain things forward, lighter now, but still hers. If someone you love is showing you a quiet kind of bravery, counting their breaths, building a plan instead of breaking down, choosing the harder, slower path toward something that actually holds, the smallest thing you can do is recognize it when you see it. Not everyone needs rescuing. Sometimes what they need is for someone to come when called, and then trust them enough to step back and let them finish it themselves. That is, in the end, what the patch on Marcus Doyle's back had always meant, long before Cedar Hollow understood it. Not a wolf that needed saving, but one that had already learned how to survive, and a brother who finally understood the difference between carrying someone and simply standing close enough that they never had to wonder whether help was coming. If this story moved something in you, the Harttails family would love to hear which part stayed with you longest. Was it the phone call? The silence in that hallway? Or the moment Claire stood up and standing? Subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. 2 more stories are already waiting. This is a work of fiction. All characters, names, locations, and events depicted in this story are entirely fictional, created for storytelling purposes. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, help is available 24 hours a day through the National Domestic Violence Hotline.